Hey everybody, welcome to 3D6 Charge. I'm your host, Chris Vo. Tonight's episode is episode 34, Enforcing Rules and Code of Conduct. Joining me tonight is Kevin Lieb.
Howdy, howdy.
Benjamin Rubenstein.
Hey everyone.
And special guest, Michael Burns.
Hello everyone.
So we brought Mike on tonight because he's a former Magic judge, and if you're unfamiliar with the Magic the Gathering competitive scene, it has some pretty rigorous and centralized rules enforcement. There's like a curriculum to becoming a judge of several different levels, going from just like a rules advisor up to like a level 3 where you're, judging, the top tier of events. So there's just a wealth of knowledge that Mike has in that competitive system, and we want to get his point, his viewpoint on what can we do as the 40K community to maybe make that rules enforcement, that code of conduct, more centralized. Because as of right now, the ITC has like a code of conduct, it has guidelines for judging. But if you cop a red card at one event, there's nothing stopping you from going to another event and copping a red card there and going to a third event and just continually getting red cards. At what point is there like somebody saying like, hey, maybe this guy is a piece of shit? So let's open it up for discussion.
So I guess that seems like a reasonable place to start. Is like talking about just like what kind of penalties get carried from event to event in Magic. Because right now in 40K nothing gets carried, right? Like people can get straight up banned from events, and unless other events like decide to just like jump on that bandwagon, like person can just go to a different event. Whereas in Magic, certain things do carry over from one event to another. Although I personally am not as familiar with exactly where the line is drawn on like what gets moved. So Mike,
Sure.
wanna fill us in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I guess for those who are watching who have some Magic knowledge, I was an L1, which is like the first official level of judging. There's 5 levels. First one is mostly for like fun events that happen at local stores. Friday Night Magic, which is sort of a weekly get together of Magic events. So that's what I was doing. I did that for about 2 years until I broke off at some point just to work on other things and switch to 40K, to be honest. So to speak to that, really it's the answer is like kind of everything carries over from event to event. So the way that Wizards works, or the way that sort of rules enforcement worked for Magic the Gathering, is that all events were put through what is called, or it was called when I was working at the Wizards Event Reporter, where essentially every event that was hosted at a store, or I should say the vast majority of events, were actually compliant with Wizards of the Coast's standards of rules. It was DCI compliance, is sort of the acronym of the association that handled sort of judging and rules enforcement by Wizards. So any sort of infractions that would occur that would merit some sort of warning of any official weight, anything above that, whether it be game losses or ejections from events, what have you, all of that was logged, even from the lowest of sort of competitive play, like just Friday Night Magic, everyone's getting together for a couple hours to play. Even those kinds of events would have sort of the carryover in history. Every player would get what's called a DCI number when they come to one of these events. And that DCI number essentially was an account that would follow you. It provided a number of benefits for players that were not like sort of rules infraction oriented. Like there was a very popular system that tracked wins and losses as you progressed. Players would have an exciting time checking out their win-loss record versus other people in the state, for instance. So there were some other benefits to it, but on sort of an organizational rules level, it also allowed everyone to be sort of organized, and you're able to really kind of tell who sort of potential bad actors might be. or at least perhaps play patterns that have popped up in previous events.
Okay. So I know one of the big hurdles when it comes to like transporting that system over into a 40K version of it is the lack of a centralized like authority. Like, you've got like the DCI number in Magic, but there'd be no such thing in Warhammer. There'd, like the DCI number that's backed by Wizards. This whole thing is run by Wizards of the Coast. And even though we've seen GW like kind of start dipping their toes into the competitive scene and supporting that competitive scene, they haven't really made too many waves in trying to become an authority in it. And then ITC itself has stated they don't want to become an authority in it. So like, I don't know. Do you see a space for another third party to kind of just create like a system, like say like, hey, let's create the 3d6 charge, like player database. We got to get buy-in from all these TOs, but we start tracking these people, and you can track your win losses and track red cards or like code of conduct violations across things.
That's the challenge, though, right? Is you have to get all the major events to buy into it. Because if if only some of them buy into it, well, then like the ones that aren't buying into it aren't really functioning. And if it's then independent of the ITC, which is the tournament circuit that everyone's mostly interested in on this podcast, then is it like really functioning? So like even if it is like a third party, the ITC, it almost has to function hand in hand with them, right? Like it doesn't really work if only
it has to, because the
are
ITC
doing it.
right now is like already doing like the fun half of it. They're already doing the win-loss tracking, the points calculations for tournament wins, for the season standings, but they're not doing like the job that nobody wants to do, which is tracking rules violations and trying to suss out bad actors.
Right. Now, the application I think that already exists and is already being used is BCP.
Yeah.
BCP isn't ITC. They work hand in hand, but it isn't them. It would have to be some group that works with BCP and tries
And
to get
this is best coast pairings for those not acronym focused.
yes,
Okay.
best coast pairing.
And that tracks wins and losses, right? Across
Right,
tournament events and lists.
I know the few times I've used it though, like my account is shared between events.
Yeah. Yep. Although the only thing there is, you need like other people. I guess like yeah, you could probably implement it in like somewhere like that. Although you wouldn't want the information to be available to everyone, or would you? Like I don't know, when you go into like in Magic, if I remember correctly, you're not like told like what warnings your opponent has had over their like Magic career.
So where was restricted to, I believe, tournament organizers, as well as the judges who might be running competitive REL events. So I'm going to be throwing out a lot of terminology here, but I should give some background to it. Wizard. So first of all, there's a lot of things that might need to happen for just to sort of see what happened in Magic to occur in Games Workshop when it comes to organized play. And Wizards of the Coast did do a lot to help in this, and I think that we've kind of skipped right to if Games Workshop isn't going to do anything, how can other people do anything? But maybe we should also mention that like Games Workshop might see. I think this is a prime opportunity for Games Workshop to step in and to follow the examples that Wizards of the Coast in the past has done to sort of set this up in advance, to kind of set it up where the community doesn't want to. I have not personally looked into why the ITC organizers said that they are not a rules enforcement body or what have you. But I can assume there's any number of reasons why you wouldn't want to be that kind of person. Now, when it comes to like tracking players and sort of like hiding that data, you can always kind of that's kind of part of it. That's certainly like an important part of it. I think that when it comes to buy-in, I think you sort of develop this to harken back to Magic. I mean, I guess I should say first of all that like Magic has changed over 20 years. It's evolved from one very different thing to another thing. During its sort of heyday, there was certainly sort of a consolidation of tournament organizers, and these were kind of regional. So on the West Coast, you had Channel Fireball, which is a merchandising store. They own a lot of, they actually own a brick and mortar store. They do a lot of online business, but they also host a lot of tournaments on the West Coast. And on the East Coast, you have Star City Games, and Star City Games, also a brick and mortar store that also advanced into being something more than that. They had an entire league set up, like a whole circuit, sort of like the PGA Tour, where people would go around and grind weekly events. And so you kind of see that kind of organically grown, large regional consolidated like event structure. And that would be, I guess, one way that you could see sort of Games Workshop. The ITC, I would say, really kind of mirrors that. And sort of this is becoming like the premier tournament level competitive style of Games Workshop, like 40K play. So ITC had an opportunity to do that. They still have the opportunity to do that, of course. But it would be something like that, where you'd have a large community service or a community grown group be the ones to sort of institute this. I think if individual TOs said that they didn't want to opt into it, I don't know if that's like a huge problem. I think honestly that the players individually would have to make the choice if they'd want to attend an event that isn't set up with this program. I not to like be like, well, if you wouldn't want to be part of this, there you'd have something to hide or whatever. But like, I think that most players would be welcoming to be able to kind of go into an event knowing that there's some infrastructure in place to watch out for them, right? To like make sure that they're having a quality, game of 40K.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
like any event that you go to, it's a pretty sizable time commitment on your part. Even if it's just a 1-day event, it's an all-day event. Nobody wants to spend like their entire day and then not have a good time. At the end of the day, ain't nobody getting rich off Warhammer.
Yeah, and
Right.
it's like 40. So Magic Gathering is a very complicated game for those who don't play it. And if you know that your opponent is sort of a bad actor, has been known to do that kind of thing, it becomes a very complicated game, because suddenly you are tracking everything that your opponent's doing, any possible sort of like slights that could happen. Like you're checking their number of cards in their hand, you're checking like mana on the table, like all these different things. And it's so much more complicated when it comes to 40K, because there's so many more pieces and the games are so much longer, that you really do not want to have to rely on sort of yourself to manage the other player and make sure that they're playing on the table, so to speak.
Yeah, I've had the unfortunate experience of rolling up to a table at GT, and like halfway through like my opponent's first shooting phase, like he was like checking something in his book, and the guy behind me was like, "Hey, you need to like watch him. Like he's a local player, and he's been kicked out most local events won't let him play because he just cheats." I was like, "Awesome! I'm glad like he's just allowed into this GT after being booted from multiple events, and now I have to like spend the rest of the game staring at him, like staring at his dice pools." Fortunately, he was playing the army that I had the most time on, and lo and behold, I caught him trying to do like, oh goodness, 11 different things. And if this was Magic, like he just like if you got booted from 3 local events, like you wouldn't be able to sign up for a GT. I don't know, maybe you would, but there'd be like some consequences, I think, after getting booted from that many events, right?
Absolutely. Yep. There were stringent sort of effects that were in place if you were to assume if you gained too many infractions, like there were DCI bans, like you would just straight up not be allowed at DCI events. These could be temporary, these could be permanent. One of the best things about sort of the DCI is the fact that there is a list of rules infractions, and there is a list of punishments for those infractions, and they just exist. There's no sort of the judge doesn't have to make a lot of judgment calls when it comes to like what punishment fits this crime. The only judgment that comes into play is what crime was committed.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about that for a second. Kind of give a Magic example, and then sort of like the Warhammer equivalent. So like the classic in Magic is like your opponent attacks you with a creature, and then you take damage from the creature, and then like the next turn you go, oh, I like that creature's power was different than what was printed on the card because one of 1,000 different things that could change that number. And then there's like a pretty straightforward fix for that. Like you call the judge, depending on who controlled the effect. Someone may or may not be like taking a penalty for ignoring like a negative thing, but like in generally speaking, I think both players get a warning, right, for messing up the game state. Is that correct?
So there's game rule violations and failure to maintain game state, which these could be. Sometimes there's these things that both players actually failed to maintain the game state, but one person has the actual games rules violation, and the punishments would be weighted accordingly. I say punishment, but oftentimes if it's a game rule violation, depending on what competition level you're playing at, these could be just verbal cautions, like, hey, make sure you're paying attention. But it can scale from there.
Yeah, so generally speaking, what I would expect to happen there is like the judge comes over and goes like, hey, like fix the life total because that had to happen, and then like don't mess up, and someone gets a warning written down. If that happens like 20 times, like in other events, like then something's probably fishy. But like chances are we both just like kind of blinked and missed it, and like whatever, we move on. And then like in Warhammer, all right, so if Warhammer, like I shoot a bunch of combi bolters at like, I don't know, some Marines, and then we pick the Marines up, and then we move to my charge phase, and then like at the end of my charge phase, I go, oh crap, like I was shooting through dense terrain. I was supposed to be at -1, which is like super easy to do. Like there's just so many different modifiers in shooting, like you can miss them. And like I missed it, my opponent missed it, and now we kind of look at each other and go, yeah, like now what? Like whose fault is that, right? Like it's not like I control the dense terrain, it's not he controlled it. Like I picked up my dice and I went 3s and then I rolled them. And neither of us caught that I was supposed to be saying 4s. So is it my fault? Is it his fault? Like, do we go back and redo it? Do we just like pick up a couple of his models back? Do I lose the whole shooting effect because I messed up? Is there going to be a record of me doing this at every table I play at for the entire event until someone like actually calls me out on it? Like, it's just so awkward because as a Warhammer player, what's your instinct if your opponent does that?
I mean, my first instinct would be like, all right, do you remember how many 3s you rolled?
Yeah. And it's interesting as a Magic player, my first instinct is, and this is kind of a meme of the Magic community, but it's judge.
Yeah, you just call a judge.
It's kind of the first. There's so many procedures in place at competitive events, and one of them is the infamous sort of judge talk, where before an event starts, the head judge of the program or the head judge of the event is like, "Hey, I'm the head judge. We're playing at this level with these these rules, and here are my L1 judges. Make sure that whenever there's a problem, and then like everyone's like, call a judge or what have you, because really, in that situation, you don't want to have to solve that problem, and you don't want your opponent to have to solve that problem either. Ideally, you have a third party arbitrate sort of what happened, rewind the clock if possible, or come up with a solution if that's necessary. When you have a third party do it, you take so much of the pressure off of yourself, maybe animosity towards your opponent. Like you have a different group that has the authority to kind of handle that situation, and you can push it off to them.
Yeah, like I don't want to say like rule one of it almost feels like rule one of Magic in like any sort of even semi-competitive event is like you don't fix the game state. If the game state is wrong, you call a judge and they fix the game state. Like even if it's like, yes, I hit you for 2 damage last turn and you went and your life is now 19 when it should be 18. Like you just call a judge to fix that. Like it doesn't matter how minor it is. Like you just want someone over to like record it, so it doesn't feel like someone's gonna like pressure it or anything. It's just like even like minor silly things that like, I don't know, like, oh, my guys move 6 inches, not 7. Let me move it back an inch. Like, nope. Like you would just call a judge. You'd be like, hey, like this happened, and the judge would be like, yeah, read your data cards, and then you move the model back, and that would be it. And it would probably be it, unless that happens again over and over. And that's why you do it, is because if there's a pattern, you're only going to find out if there's a pattern if judges get called.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is like one of the but this is one of the difficulties even in the Magic community I see is like people don't want to call the judge a lot of the time because it's like oh, what, you don't trust me, or you think I'm a cheater. It's like, even though like I've made rule mistakes in Magic and in 40K, everyone has that knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, you're calling me a cheater. It's not. That's not what's happening. It's because most of the time you're not a cheater. Like you could legitimately just forget how far your model's supposed to move. Really.
You want to look
there's
at
a lot
my
of rules to
codex?
track.
Yeah. Chat is saying, with dice being less able to recall or regulate, would a system like this require players to tabulate or track rolls? Um, I mean, there are situations right in Magic where like you've realized something has gone wrong at some point in the game that like you can't return to it. Like people have seen cards that they wouldn't have had access to now, and like things have changed, and like maybe a decision had to be made that wasn't made at the time, and now like information is known. Like there are certainly also situations in Magic where you can't just roll back the game, but this is beyond just like rolling the game back to like where this thing happened. A lot of it is like fixing it in the way that's like the most equitable as possible without like the two players being the ones who decide it, because I'm always, if I'm fixing a problem in my game, I'm trying to, always be like good faith, make it as fair as possible. If I made the mistake, I'll like, I'll take it, in my opponent's favor because like it's on me. But like, not everyone is coming from that position. Some people like, oh, a mistake was made, like just want to get the most out of it. Especially if like if your opponent's the person who messed up. I know plenty of people who, they think if their opponent messed up, like the punishment for their opponent messing up should be like pretty heinous. And that's like, I'm not saying these people are wrong. That's like a reasonable stance to have. If the opponent makes rules mistakes, they should get punished for it. But the person who decides how much they get punished for it shouldn't be their opponent. It should be a third party.
Yeah, and ideally, they would know ahead of time how much they would be punished from that situation, or at least that would be accessible to them. To specify for the person in chat, I don't think you would require any sort of tabulated tracking of rolls. When these sort of situations arise in Magic, if there's some sort of random element, oftentimes it's going back to that random element, randomizing it once again, and then going from there. So if there's some sort of problem with your deck where you see a card incorrectly or what have you, but perhaps like for some reason the bottom 5 cards of the deck, you take the bottom 5 cards of the deck away, you shuffle what's left, you put it back, and you go from there. And I assume that would be what we might be looking at when it comes to Games Workshop, like 40K games. Like, of course, that leads... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so do you think like the 40K version would be like, oh, you're supposed to have -1. All right, just do that attack again at -1?
I think so. And, to preempt, somebody might saying like, oh, well, couldn't somebody use that to their advantage? Absolutely. Anyone can use these sorts of things to their advantage. It's making sure that you have people in place that are able to look at that judgment call, make that kind of call, and investigate to see if that perhaps is a regular pattern that's occurring, and then dealing with it from there. Like, we talk a lot about like opponents kind of playing to advantages when it comes to these rules. The vast majority of Magic rules, like competitive Magic rules, are about situations that are not like on purpose. Tons of things are about complete accidents, things that, Ben, you've already talked about. There's only like a couple rules to deal with like people that are doing this on purpose. And those are very serious and taken very seriously.
Yeah, so to the point of somebody doing it on purpose, like shooting through dense terrain and getting that -1 the hit, I forget about that stuff all the time. And you're right, somebody could take advantage of it if they realize that, they rolled very poorly, they just rolled like a lot of 1s and 2s. They could very conveniently forget that they rolled through dense terrain, they shot through dense terrain, and they get to re-roll that. All right, that's fine. Maybe the judge comes over and is like, all right, just, go back to that randomized result, re-randomize it, re-roll the dice. That's fine. But then maybe that person does it, forgets about dense terrain again, even though the judge said, hey, this piece on this table, like it is on every other table because this is a GT, is dense terrain. Just keep that in mind next time you're shooting through it. But then that person forgets again. All right, well, so right, there's a lot of rules. Maybe there's no tokens on the terrain saying it's dense. Hey man, really, like, remember it this time. It's dense, it's -1 the hit. And then this guy does it again. Now, because the judge has been called every time, the judge can be like, I think that you're trying to take advantage of this and you're just rolling shitty on this particular shot, and you said you forgot about the -1, so you get to re-roll it and hopefully get a better result. That's where calling the judge comes in. It's not like calling somebody a cheater, even though this fake person is. It's about getting that neutral third-party arbitrator in to make that call. Because like if you're playing a friendly game, somebody says, oh, I forgot to do the -1, you'd be like, all right, I don't know, like on a 4-up, like you lose one more guy. In a casual game, that's fine. In a tournament game, that might not fly.
Yeah, it would be so important in this environment to be able to just call a judge in that situation. the tracking, I mean, when you the physical part of the tracking is quite simple. I mean, at Magic events, it was just you take the judge takes your match slip, and just on the back would write like verbal caution, or not verbal, but VC or CW, just whatever acronyms are necessary. When it goes over to the tabulation, it gets put in, and then if it happens a second time, we bump it up to like a game loss violation or what have you. So the practical part of it is very reproducible for 40K.
Yeah, because I mean, like, you get a score sheet. You got to submit your score sheet at the end of the round. Sorry, I couldn't think of a word. At the end of the round, like when you're playing at like the RT level. At the GT level, you're usually submitting results on BCP. But again, if you're a judge at a GT, you're gonna have access to BCP anyway. You're gonna be able to put that put like a note in there.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Kevin.
But let's talk about but why? It seems obvious to us, but let's really dig into why would someone want this type of system? Why would I want to have the risk of getting in trouble added to my game?
This is another reason I've chosen to, or I suggested Burns as a person to have on, is for those who have not ever played against him, he is a competent 40K player who is, I'd like to say, semi-competitive. Like you've brought competitive lists to events before, but for the most part, you kind of just like play what interests you. And you'd like to be able to show up to events and sort of like have like a fair shake of things. And coming from Magic, you have like a very like clear sense of like how you kind of would imagine events to be run, and 40K can kind of be the Wild West of rules enforcement in a way. And I don't know, you've said some things that I think that bear repeating on, like why is it important for a game to have like a codified rules enforcement system?
Yes. Okay. So in lieu of me pulling out my like 5-step plan or reason for why this needs to happen, just to briefly discuss it, you really it's all about setting up an environment that welcomes players who may not be familiar with the location or the players that are there, to come in and have a sort of base understanding of what their 40K experience is going to be like. Because as I personally can attest to, when you're going from your local game store to another local game store, or perhaps to a GT, a larger event, there's definitely, I think, a chilling effect in terms of like, I don't know these people, I don't know these players. Are we gonna jive, or are these people going to like be cutthroat? Are we going to be looking for angles to play? And I'm not talking about like cheating here. I'm talking about like people being in a professional setting, perhaps being more like cooler than usual, versus sort of the jovial 40K game that everyone here is, I'm sure, very aware, like have played before countless times. And so when it comes to sort of the competitive rules enforcement at these events, it helps to sort of lift the burden of maintaining that environment away from the players and sort of to the judges, or at least it's splitting it, right? Because you obviously want to be a good opponent for your opponent. You want to be a good player. And you also want to make sure that like both of you are having a good time at the table. Now, a lot of, and this kind of might diverge a little bit into sort of like horror stories from 40K tournaments. But oftentimes I have several friends who, while I'm not particularly competitive, or at least I don't go to tournament play as much as some of my friends, I've had several that go to a lot of tournaments, at least before the pandemic. And they've given me a wealth of different experiences that grade against me in terms as a Magic player and as an ex-judge or former judge. In particular, a lot of these experiences come from dealing with TOs that might not necessarily want to get involved in sort of the unfun aspects of running a tournament, like rules enforcement. TOs that may have personal history with players, and thus their sort of neutrality comes into play or is suspect. And these are kinds of things that the judge programs tend to weed out, because you're dealing with third parties. Oftentimes judges travel as well. And there's just a higher standard, right? When there's a codified organization, there's just a certain set of criteria that are instilled in people. So yeah, I think a lot of why I'd want to see judges show up at 40K events is because it allows people to sort of focus on their game, focus less on their opponent's actions in terms of like a meta sense, and also just be comforted with the idea of knowing that like if something goes wrong, if you're not having a great time for some sort of reason, there's somebody to go to that you're confident will be able to solve the issue that you're having. Like going into specifics, like there have been stories about players doing things that are incredibly unsportsmanlike to other players, and there not being like great ways to resolve that. Actions that would lead people being thrown out of competitive Magic events quite quickly, where for some reason the TO felt that they couldn't do anything about it, or they chose not to do anything about it. And Games Workshop, nobody really provides a straight, like, this is bad, you need to stop this sort of mentality. It's like sort of all kind of ephemeral, right? The TOs kind of have to make their own decisions in the moment about how they're going to deal with things. I think that's a lot of pressure on tournament organizers that they might not want to deal with, and maybe they shouldn't have to.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the upside of having a judge is that, especially when you're like in that scenario where you're going to like a new store and a new community where you don't know anybody, is when you're talking about rules enforcement, if you bring up a rule and then you try to like enforce it or rule on it as a player, you're acting as the bad guy. When you ask for a judge, that bad guy role gets shifted off from you and gets placed onto the judge. The judge is the one who makes the call. The judge is the one who who can be the bad guy, which alleviates a lot of that responsibility off of yourself as a player, which leads to you probably playing better, having a better time because you don't have to be the bad guy. And then I think to your point where the TOs feel like they can't do anything, or they don't want to upset the community members who are maybe there. If there were a more codified code of conduct or rules enforcement or punishments, like, I don't know, Matrix, then that document can be the bad guy. The judge can just be like, hey man, I'm just going by this document here that says I have to kick you out because you're being a shitheel.
Yeah, and that's certainly a thing that's been used, that I've seen be used in a Magic environment, where the DCI has certain things that you cannot do, and they're very explicit about what those things are. Particularly when it comes to major unsportsmanlike conduct, when it comes to cheating, and those things. The DCI, it's very clear you're thrown out of the event, and the TOs can absolutely fall back on, like, this is a DCI thing. I don't want to lose my DCI status. I need to enforce this rule, which is just
going to be like, my hands are tied. I have to do this. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
And what helps with that too is Wizards is pretty strict, like pretty strict, and like pretty happy. I mean, not happy, but like they will come down on stores that don't enforce things like this. Like, I don't know, if someone like blows their lid and is like yelling and screaming at their opponent in a Magic event, and the judge doesn't boot them, and someone else at the event is like, "Hey Wizards, I like witnessed this thing," and the judge was like, "Hey Kevin, stop screaming at your opponent," and like then Kevin stops screaming, and they're like, "All right, move on, keep playing." Like, that store is getting in trouble. Like, they're not just like, oh, whatever. Like, Wizards is gonna like investigate that thing, and like that store could like potentially just like get cut off from being allowed to run sanctioned events. Which, if you're a Magic store, just means you're dead. Like, your business is over.
Yeah. For like, I would say the past 15 years. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, which just means like, so like, which really does give judges the ability to just be like, no, like, this is happening, and like neither you nor I can control it. Like, we have to follow these rules.
Right. And to pivot the topic a little bit, really, like, I think for the past 15 years, Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, when Hasbro acquired them, have really been taking a hard look at what their community is and who they're selling their cards to. And they have a very specific view when it comes to what they want their community to be. They want it to be inclusive. They want it to be open to new players. They really were, I think, trying to fight sort of a view that may have been encouraged early in their Magic games of like the local game store, and it's like particular like environment, and it's like not welcoming, and it's kind of scary to interact with. And Wizards of the Coast has been really trying to change that and change that around. And I think they've done an excellent job in doing so, up until to now. And I think that Games Workshop needs to do something similar if it wants to continue to have 40K grow and expand at the rapid pace that it has been.
Yeah, I think GW is doing the promotion and the growth aspect half of it phenomenally. Like 8th edition had a huge surge of growth in the game. GW's financial statements have never looked better because of how many models they're selling. But to that end, they've also got to take the opposite tack too, like Wizards, and be willing to come down on stores. Now, granted, there's no like sanction events thing, so they can't just pull like Friday night Warhammer away from stores and not give people ITC points anymore. And GW sure as hell isn't just going to pull accounts because somebody yelled at during a game once, but I don't know. I don't know what GW being strict would look like.
Keep in mind, when we're talking about like pulling like stores availability, they're also given like a few warn. It's not like
it's not one and done. You get strikes.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah,
that's the thing that the stores and sort of WotC have always been kind of like going back and forth about what sort of what are the punishments in place or what have you. But really, I think GW has all of the building blocks necessary to kind of do this sort of thing. I mean, we see plenty of companies that are not GW have community organizational like promotions. Like our favorite game company ever, Fantasy Flight Games, I know would have benefits for going to organized play nights that were separate from sort of like event, like basically they would give product to a store to be distributed if you go to a certified event, right? So like before, WotC had to build out so that every event had to be a DCI event, and they did so by giving product that stores could give out for free if you were to go to those events. And Games Workshop has like they do the Primaris Lieutenants of the month or what have you. Like they have like tons of custom. I mean, we see them in Warhammer community all the time when they have like Games Workshop store exclusive models. Like those would be an excellent thing to use. They have White Dwarf; those would be fine to use. I think they have a ton of incentives that they could kind of warp to move into this sort of situation. But right now, Games Workshop's only directive is if there's a rules issue, roll a d6, and that's not quite enough.
I actually detest that exists. I've had an opponent actually ask me to do that in like an actual factual competitive event with prizes on the line, and I was just like, "You want me to do what?" Like, no, that's insane. Like,
there's a rules disagreement, and you want to leave it to chance?
Like,
no, there's a right and a wrong to this rule. Let's spend 5 minutes to find out what it is instead of just rolling a dice.
Right, absolutely. And like I think that Games Workshop is in this position where they know that sort of kitchen table players, the players that are very casual, they're not going to events, they're hobbyists to the core, make up a majority of their bottom line. Wizards of the Coast is often reported. Now this might be out of date because I haven't been following Wizards as much recently, but at one point it was a 6-to-1 kitchen table to event attendees. And that's a huge ratio, and yet they still came up with all of these methods for incentivizing organized play, rewarding organized play, and like making it standardized.
And for that ratio in Warhammer, I would not be surprised if it was double or triple that ratio, if it was 12 or even 18 kitchen table players to one competitive player. Because think about it, like, yes, Magic is fun, you can play it like casually, and you can collect the cards. But Warhammer as a hobby is a little bit more all encapsulating, where you might just like reading the books, or you might just like painting minis, and I would count those as the kitchen table players as well.
I don't know if that's true as much, because like there's more than just like competitive events. Because with Magic events, you're bringing competitive decks, you're trying to kill each other. There's not a lot of ways around that. There's lots of people who bring casual lists to events and have fun at the lower tables. Like, I don't know that many Warhammer players who've never been to an event. I know like a couple. I know I'm an event player, so I've met a lot of Warhammer players at events. But like, even like stores that I like, the stores that I frequent locally, like the casual players there still just like go to casual events when the stores hold them.
Yeah, and on a meta level, people love to sort of have reasons to play the game beyond like, let's just show up and play the game. The 3 of the 4 of us have participated in escalation leagues, and that is something that would be considered, in my opinion, organized play, because there is a rules system in place to sort of mandate the play that's going on. And that's kind of like not just competitive events, but also organized play, leagues, any sort of like collection of players that sort of like mandates some sort of rules enforcement when things inevitably come up, because things will. 40K is an incredibly complicated game.
Yeah. So the chat's mentioning, do you think that this sort of thing would require GW changing its promotional product model from one of paying to access promotional stuff to playing to access promotional stuff? And I know when Kill Team first rolled out, it was a play to access thing. You had to participate in like your store's Kill Team campaign, and you got the a little baggie of dice and some cool objective markers, and like I think like a button, and then I don't think they've had too many actual pay to access things. Like I remember a couple of months ago, the GW stores were giving out like Crux Terminatus patches for free. You just went in and could just get one for free. That was my intention when I went to go get my patch, and then I saw this thing for sale. So I was like, oh, well, damn, this promotional aspect worked, because I just spent $40 that I didn't mean to spend.
Does it come with the good gun, though? I'm a little concerned.
Which one is the good gun? I can't tell.
I'm sorry, you've been given a Gauss flare. Better luck next time.
Wrong one. The Reaper's the good one, the double barreled. Go ahead, Kevin.
I mean, GW has been doing a monthly, you come in, you get a free built model in a box and a token that has to do with the faction of it. So like last week was I had Lumineth. You got a free Lumineth Spearman and a Lumineth token. I have actually some tokens from, oh no, like I got a Death Guard model, and here's my Death Guard token. The model's chillaxing upstairs.
That's pretty
neat. And I know that in 8th edition, I used the darn Battle for Macragge objective markers. They gave out like a cardboard like thing of objective markers and wound tokens and stuff like that, and I used that a lot when I was first starting. So they've definitely dipped their toes in it. Absolutely. Like, was that for Kill Team or Shadow War Armageddon? They've tried a couple of these things over the years.
Battle for Macragge was just like 40K.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, 100%. I meant the Kill Team like.
Yeah, that was specifically for a Kill Team campaign.
Gotcha.
That was right when like Kill Team launched, and it was that kind of promotional stuff totally worked on me too, because I bought a box of Harlequins, and they are the only Eldar that I own.
All right. So the last thing that I kind of want to touch on that we've kind of skirted around it without actually talking about specifically is the actual judges in the judge program. And I actually want to go back to the example where my opponent literally asked me to roll a d6 to figure out a rules thing. It had to do with the smite psychic power not being an attack with characteristics. And he asked me to roll this die, and it was like, and I knew that I was correct. I was very sure. And I knew that if I like lose this die roll, I'm in a lot of trouble this game. So I was like, that's nonsense. And then I look at the person, the TO, who's more of a casual player. This is more of a casual event. And I'm like, man, if I call him over, I'm like still 50-50. So I'm just gonna like pull out the books myself and like try to show my opponent that he's wrong. And that's kind of a miserable position to be in, where it's like, no, let's not get the TO because he's probably also not really sure. It's not knocking the TO. He organized a great event. It's just like he wasn't necessarily there to enforce rules. And in Magic, TOs and rules enforcement people can be separate. Like you can be the person who puts the event together and not the person who's going to enforce rules there. And like, because like think about like 40K, right? You're organizing an event, you're getting trained together, you're putting packets together, rules packets, figuring out which missions are gonna be fun to play, looking at your tables, getting objective markers. There's like a lot that goes into that. Like you can do all that and run a successful event without being also the person who's enforcing every rules call of that event. Like that could be someone else, and that's fine. One of the great things about the Magic rules enforcement system, judges, is that you don't get to just like be a judge. You have to like take a test. You have to prove that like you know what you're talking about, that you can a base amount of the base rules, and that you can then also interpret some of the more complicated weird rules interactions on the fly. And that's like a really important thing to have in a judge, so that when players are calling you over, they're fairly confident that they are getting correct rulings.
Yeah, I think that there's it. Before I've said that there's a problem with the sort of the environment, or perhaps the sort of the concept of asking people like to verify their rules, and we haven't really talked about that too much. Where it's people are really they take offense when you ask for some sort of clarification. They will like give you a bit of a shocked face if you like ask to see their codex. Could you read the rules out to me? I'm trying to find out like what's going on here. And that's sort of a mindset that needs to be broken in order to move forward oftentimes, because not only does that lead to sort of some really awkward engagements where you suddenly like you ask like, oh, is this a rapid fire or advance? And they say like rapid fire, and you're pretty sure it's advanced, and you're like, can I look at the book? And they just say like no, or I'm sorry, rapid fire and assault. Yes.
Okay.
And basically, there's a rule that you want to check, and they say no. Well, it's like, what do you do at that point? I think oftentimes with the people that play Magic, and people in general, they'll just let it go. They don't want to push the issue. They don't want to be antagonistic or even seem antagonistic, even though what they're doing is perfectly reasonable. And that's sort of a community thing that needs to be resolved, honestly. And I think judges would do like third party judges would be an excellent benefit for that. Magic, oh sorry.
No, go for it.
Oh, I was just gonna finish by saying like in Magic, like you can't have a card right on the board or whatever, and you can't be like, hey, what is the text on Tarmogoyf? Like what is that line of text there? They can't say no, I'm not gonna tell you what it is. Like you can't look at it. They can't put their hand over it. Like you can at any point call a judge and ask for a text from any card in the entirety of Magic's history. They will give you the text. And that is basic information. There's no gotcha allowed in that sort of situation. And that's just something that you need to avoid in 40K as well.
So it's interesting in 40K because I listened to some people who have been judges at big events, and they were essentially tired of being the rules people. So the person carrying around the rule book for other people, because this was back when like certain tournaments weren't even you were expected to bring in your rule book, but some people just didn't. And what they started doing was like, oh, there's a rules dispute and you don't have your rule book. The other person's right. Deal with it. Like that assassin, it's T1. Congratulations, you didn't bring your book. You can't defend yourself.
Yeah.
You're not willing to show your book. You can't defend yourself. The other guy's right. It's that easy.
And to go with just to jump on what Burns was saying about the mentality of like you ask for someone rules and they say no and they just back off. Kevin and I have been in this situation. We played in a team event where our opponent didn't bring rules, and we're both Magic players. Like it's ingrained in us that you just call a judge, and we just didn't. We just didn't, because we're playing 40K and it's a different beast. And when people get belligerent, you just kind of back off, because it's so ingrained in the community that me coming from a community where that's just like not the thing you do, I still do it sometimes. And since that particular case, I've been trying to be better about just like calling judges, but like sometimes the judges aren't prepared.
Right.
That particular judge was very prepared. Had I called that judge, they would have been ready, but I didn't.
Yeah,
that's on me.
And also like TOs don't want to like say no to somebody who just spent, I don't know, $30-$40 to go to this event. Like they're terrified about losing a player to like losing their registration fee or what have you. They don't want to say no to these people.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind that a lot of these events, like the majority of the people that go to these events are regular patrons of that store. And then on top of that, these events are ways of growing the community of the store.
Right. And so oftentimes there's like, I know local stores near me, there's not an expectation to bring the codex. There's not an expectation to bring any erratas or FAQs. and that just leads to bad play experiences. Like when you're just like, I'll bring Battlescribe and that'll be fine, like just Battlescribe. That's a disaster, because Battlescribe is community driven. Battlescribe can be wrong.
There's some like Eldar super heavies that have 50 attacks because it's supposed to be a 40-inch gun and they put it for the attack thing, and it's just like it. I don't think your 400-point tank is 50 strength 12 attacks. Like, well, it says right here. Okay.
Well, you can't. I mean, I didn't bring my codex, so like, what are we gonna do about this? And
roll a d6. 4 up is you were right.
Games Workshop set it up for us. Perfect.
And I kind of want to bring this like, or talk about like a more real life scenario. Like, think about COVID-19 and wearing masks and people feeling weird about like either not getting together or being asked to wear masks, or like all the like anxiety around that, where people were kind of going from you could just go interact with someone to like now you had to wear a mask and you kind of look like a fool if you didn't. It took a while for people to really buy into that or feel that. And
hold on. Right along these lines, I'm sure some of you guys have been out in public at like a store or whatever and seen somebody not wearing a mask or like wearing it as like a chin diaper. Have any of you guys like gone up to that person and be like, "Hey man, you're not wearing your mask correctly"? I know I haven't. I know I should, but I haven't because I don't want that confrontation, you know? And I imagine that there's a lot of parallels between that and asking somebody to see their rules or like see their rule book.
Only in the context of my job as a teacher, but no, never just like a random stranger who's just like not wearing their mask.
Yeah, I think generally we are we're risk averse creatures. We don't want to have to create conflict where we don't want to. And really, the less conflict, the better when it comes to sort of playing a game. And oftentimes, I know, and I'm sure you guys haven't too. I have a wealth of friends who are very quiet. They don't want to be their own advocate when it comes to these situations. They would rather just try and keep it cool, keep it level as long as possible, even if it's costing them their game. If it's like they know they're being run over. They don't want to speak up in those situations. And so it's really important to have somebody at these events who can speak up and advocate for them.
Exactly. So the point I want to make with my example is like usually like if you really feel strong about it, what are you gonna probably do? You're probably gonna find somebody who works at the store and tell them, "Hey, there's a dude over here not wearing a mask," because you don't want to be the bad guy, and now you can have that guy, aka the judge, go be the bad guy.
Yeah, excellent example.
Right. And like occasionally you run into bad actors, but in general, and this actually comes from when I used to be a magician, I believe
Wait,
the majority.
what? A
Oh, did you
magician?
not know that Kevin
Like-
used to be a street magician? He used
like
to be
with
a
your
street
hands?
magician. All right, moving on.
Yeah.
Kevin, tell us about your street magician days.
So one of my solutions whenever I would deal with a heckler is I would essentially give the heckler what they wanted. They'd be like, "Oh, you want me to go?" And I'd walk off the stage. And you know what people would do? The rest of the crowd wanted me to be there. They would pick on that guy. Because the rest of the crowd are good people. That one person wanted to be the jerk. And it's the same kind of thing where it's like you'd be surprised like once you start getting these systems in place how smooth or how much people actually just want this. It seems scary now, but people want this even if they don't realize it. Because I guarantee you most of those people would have never said they would have stood up for a person doing magic tricks against a friend of theirs, or um they never would have said they would have done that like a few hours beforehand. But turns out that like in the moment people generally want to do good things. It's not humanity's not evil.
Yeah, for sure. Like and like to bring that back to like it's nice to have an arbiter. Like even when like I have a friends group, and when we're playing, we draft Magic sometimes outside of stores or in a store without the store running it. Well, back in the before times, as Omar would say. We would amongst ourselves figure out who's judging the event. Like we'd be like, all right, like I'm judging the event, and if the call is for my game, then Kevin will answer or whatever. Because it's such a convenient system where like people don't have to be the bad guy, and you just get this like really consistent rules enforcement.
Yeah, and that also, I guess, to speak to that too, judges never played in the same event that they would judge at. Big no for Magic. They don't. they don't participate. They're too busy. There's a lot of stuff going on that I don't know if like regular event players like notice how much their TO has to do. It's actually amazing how much a store owner can do while also trying to TO a tournament. That it's impressive to me that one person tries to take on all that responsibility, because whenever I've done competitive events at my local store, the TO and the judge were very different people, and doing very different things.
Yeah, whenever I run a 40K event, I don't play in it. Like I don't want to play in it. I want to be able to watch the games, like, and I want to be able to watch the games full time, because it's not just the judge's job to like call people, like go to calls when they're getting called. Like you're also supposed to be watching games, and like, because like we've been talking about, there's like this sort of weird social contract in 40K. There's the social contract, big capital, which is like we live in a society. And then there's a social contract for playing a game of 40K. And these two contracts are very different. There's overlap, but in some ways they're very different. And sometimes the, capital social contract kind of dictates that like you don't call your opponent on stuff. And sometimes, that just lets people get away with stuff, or like you get into situations where you're not sure what's going on. You just like don't call a judge over because like you feel like you'd be like accusing your opponent of something, when like really you're just like, I lost you like 4 psychic powers ago, like what's happening.
Yeah.
So
sure.
chat has an interesting question, and it's brought up another point that I wanted to make. So chat's asking, all right, you mentioned judges in Magic have to test and qualify. Is there a regular requirement for recertification to keep up with rules changes? And then the second part of that, like, I know Magic has what's called the stack, or like the order of operations. So, when what card effects take precedence or happen before other ones, and how GW's been kind of like getting dragged towards that, like kicking and screaming with things like attacker's advantage and mathematical order of operations.
Oh, you're so right. I never thought about that.
GW's getting dragged towards that direction just because they need to continually clarify, like, no, the Belt of Rust doesn't turn this off. Yes, Demon Heads always fight first, even though this thing says no. Yes, Transhuman always works, even though poisoned weapons say they wound on 2-up. So basically, one, do you have to restart to keep up with rules changes in Magic as a judge? And two, drawing on your knowledge of the Magic stack and having been a player of 40K in 8th and 9th edition, what can 40K take from the stack?
Okay, so for question one, yes, if you are an L1 or above currently, so previously L1s were exempt from this, but I believe now all L1 and above judges need to recertify. And part of that recertification, basically you have to judge events. You have to be put into the machine as having judged a number of events to keep up your status. I don't believe there is actually a test involved at the end of that, but if you are going to these events weekly and judging these events weekly, the rules, I believe DCI, like the program has kind of considered you to be pretty proficient with them for the most part. Now, when you start up the program, you do have to take a test. In that test, the questions on it are only specific to the set that is out at the current time. So for instance, if you're playing during like this particular set, you're only going to have questions that refer to cards from that set. So that's kind of a way of keeping both the program current as well as people's interpretations of the rules current as well, just checking on like our players up to date with the most recent kind of cards.
So have they been just testing Throne of Eldraine for the last year and a half?
They may or may not be testing just Throne of Eldraine for the past year and a half. But sometimes cards don't have to be good to be considered part of standard. So I think Kaldheim might have like the most card questions ever, because every card has 3 paragraphs worth of text on them, and how they interact. So with regards to the second question of like, how can we sort of translate the stack from Magic to 40K? Standardization. In my mind, the things that would be most deserving of this is all of the command stratagems. And when do stratagems take place? Like, when specifically do they take place? Because oftentimes, so in Magic, there's a system called priority. Priority is when does a player have the opportunity to do something, cast a spell or what have you, and that is very specific. That priority happens at the beginning and end of each phase, or if your opponent does something. And then there's things that interact outside of that in terms of what's called state-based actions, like what's occurring in between, sort of like when players have the opportunity to do anything. It gets very complicated. It's very in depth because Magic's a complicated game. But WotC have painstakingly drawn out every conceivable opportunity for when things happen in the game. And Games Workshop has been moving towards that with their FAQs and their erratas. They try and answer a lot of these. And I think that moving from 8th edition to 9th edition, they've tried to codify some of these rules to be more standardized. But one only needs to look at fighting last and sort of a general fighting last concept to understand that they have ways to go, because there's a lot of different... I can say that this thing makes you fight last, but there are several... There's like
does it make you fight last, or does it make you uneligible to activate until every other unit has activated? Because those are two different things.
I got one for you guys. If I am playing Gene Stealer cults and I have 2 command points, and my opponent uses a stratagem, and off of their stratagem I generate my 3rd command point, can I then use a plan generations in the making to stop their stratagem with the command point I just got from their stratagem?
Yeah, it's an excellent question.
The answer is yes, but it's not obvious.
And it's also like when you have that question, who do you go to, right?
Yeah.
Like who answers that question? Also, I think Games Workshop has set themselves up for a bit of an awkward moment where they have narrative games / open play, and then they have match play. And match play has some very specific things going on in it that are different from open play. And that leads to a lot of confusion when it comes to, like, say, how many times you can use a stratagem, how many command points you can gain in a particular phase, where, like, as written on the card, you might be able to get as many command points as you want with Kirov's Aquila or what have you. And I might be losing a bit of 8th and 9th edition knowledge here, but
no, you're right.
Yeah. So like in match play, Kirov's Aquila, you get 1 command point, a battle, your turn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone's on like any 40K Facebook group, that about once every other month, someone posts, "Holy crap, guys, such and such unit can deep strike on turn 1. It's excellent." And it's just like, nope, they can't. They're all written that way. It's just that rule's just somewhere else.
Yeah. So it's in the core rules you can deep strike turn 1, but when you look at the match play rules, and there's a little addendum that says you can't deep strike turn 1. And the thing about standardization that gets me is we had it. They were called Universal Special Rules. It was in 7th edition, and then in 8th edition, everybody who had deep strike now had stuff like Manta Strike or teleportation, or there was all just different things. So, and you can't just say deep strike. You can't do it turn 1 ever, and then have it affect every unit that uses that universal special rule. Now it's just units that come from reserves can't come from reserves turn 1, no matter what their ability is named, because they're all named something different.
Yeah, and then we had that confusion, like, well, if I'm on the table and then I get taken off the table and then put back on the table on turn 1, is that allowed? And like that was unclear for a while, and like turns out like, yeah, that's fine, because when we say reserves, we mean things that were off the table at the beginning of the game, obviously. Like now we all know that, and that's sort of just like natural, but like, yeah, we just need some more clarification. Like there are some things that probably could have kept universal special rules that just didn't.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of a culture switch between 40K and Magic the Gathering, where Magic the Gathering rules are sacrosanct. Like the rules, the game does not change when it comes to the rules. Instead, you have different formats that might include how decks can be changed. But like for the most part, like a 40K or a game of Magic is a game of Magic. Whereas if you play open play versus match play, there's a lot of things that can get completely missed between the two of those things. And I think that GW, in my opinion, as a person who again, semi-competitive, doesn't go to a lot of tournaments, doesn't do a lot of have a lot of competitive games, I would much rather that match play be the default setting, not open play or narrative play, because I think that the match play offers the most mirrored experience, like the most balanced experience, and I like balance in my games. Which is where that's where I come from in that sort of equation.
I want to say though they did do mainly they didn't get rid of the other modes, but they definitely push the main missions in the new core rulebook to be very close to the match play rules.
Yes,
Mhm.
and they also made the match play rules very similar to ITC rules with regards to the mission objectives. So there's definitely Games Workshop is definitely moving towards a better place, in my opinion, with their rule sets and how they're doing it. When it
But
comes to, oh, sorry.
but they need to take the next big step, right? It's like you can have like a really refined rule system. We don't have that yet. But even with that, unless you have a judge coming in, there will still be the disputes. As long as part of that refined rule set is roll off, whoever wins is right when there's a dispute, there's problems with your rule system.
Yeah, like rules only exist if they're enforced, right? Like you can have the most excellent rule system ever. If you don't have an enforcing body, like okay, and I mean the rules are pretty, I guess.
Let me tell you about rock paper versus shoot. Shoot always wins.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Where,
And I
where's
think
the rule saying it doesn't?
yeah, I think tournament organizers. I think first of all, tournament organizers just need to be prepared to say no to players, which is difficult. It's very difficult when you're looking at events that in Magic, you're looking at 30-person events, 50-person events. If one person has a quote unquote big problem and needs to take off and you refund their thing, it's not a big deal. But oftentimes 30 is a lot of players for 40K. 30 is a ton of players. And so if you're missing out on a 40K person, it's understandably much more difficult to say like straight up, no, you can't play because you brought your list in like a notepad and it's scribbled around and you didn't bring your codex or FAQs or what have you. I think it's a big change when it comes. TOs have to be prepared to say no to people, and players need to have expectations put in place. Like players just need to need all the things that we've talked about already. They need to have lists prepared so that somebody might be able to check those lists. That's something that sort of tangentially, I'm so surprised that nobody does sort of like list checking at organized events or
They do enough, yeah.
Okay, good. Because like there's just so many ways, man. Like
Yeah,
there's so many ways that you can make a
shave
complete
points.
accident. Like, oops, like I forgot to account for like the melt a pistol cost for something. Like all of a sudden I'm playing with like, I don't know, 200 more points than I should.
Yeah,
Yeah.
LVO checks lists, and then Warzone Atlanta has an interesting system where they take everybody's lists and then it just posts it online, and they just tell people, hey, just look through things at random.
Yeah, and yeah, that's great for those bigger organizations, and I'm glad that they do that. It's also just making sure that like TOs or like smaller events can do that too, because that's where the sort of the metamorphosis occurs, right? When a player goes from casually playing kitchen table every month, once a month with a friend, to sort of moving into a local game store, playing there, and inevitably they want to become sort of a person that goes to weekly events. And I think part of that journey is being able to make sure that those players become accustomed to that, and so that they should just be prepared to bring a list, and that list be correct.
Because that's like the worst call you could get, right? Like as a 40K judge, like all right, like we're done with the event. And then like 20 minutes left in the event, like my top table calls over and the guy in second place goes, all right, like I've just lost, but I just realized my opponent's listed 100 points over. Well, cool. They've beaten 3 people with that list at 100 points over. Like what do I do? Do I just like go, all right, guys, like I'm refunding everyone, just go home or pretending the event didn't happen? All of his losses, turn all of their wins to losses. Do I just fix this one game? Like lists will slip through with mistakes in them. It's just inevitable. But I feel like having a list check at the beginning is so important. And this goes back to our previous conversation we've had. It's one of the reasons it's so important that GW gets their list builder correct, because people are going to build armies on that thing. And I can't think of a faction that it actually handles correctly. Like it actually messes up almost every single faction that I've seen discussed on it. And like people are going to build lists on it, and they're going to show up to events with those lists, and those lists are going to be wrong, and it's going to be a disaster. But that's a separate discussion. I really do think that like even like for small events, like even when I run small events, I go like, all right, like I don't know, like 3 days before, like get me your list. Like I need your list 3 days before. Like it's just,
I mean,
you need to.
And this kind of goes to like everything we've talked about. You have to be willing to give up something in order to get something. Like I have to be willing to submit my list 3 days early, so someone doesn't bring an extra 100 points on me. There is a cost associated with what you get. I have to be willing to say that if I like accidentally screw up a rule 3 times because I'm having a really bad day, I will get punished for it because I don't want the person who's actually abusing that rule to not get punished for it. It's like there's a cost.
Yeah, and this is like the perfect moment to like once again bring up the fact that like TOs need to be doing other things when they're supposed to be judging Warhammer events, right? Like they need to be like being a store owner, or like somebody else essentially should be involved in like doing deck checks, answering judge calls, doing all those things. And I think that having a judge program in Games Workshop would be an excellent way to do that, particularly because like almost all the local tournaments I know have relied purely on community support, like having a person being like, I am this person, I'm going to run your tournament for free, like for no cost. I'm going to sit there for 9 hours and just watch people play games, which is like good on them because that's incredible. Like judges got paid, like Magic judges were like compensated for their time. And right now a lot of 40K events are like purely run by people that are like either doing it for very little or for nothing.
What are you talking about? The pat on the back is worth so much.
Oh no,
the
but you
pat
can
on the
awkwardly
back
be
and the
yelled at by
$10 in the
somebody
store
too.
credit.
What about one Nagash? I heard there was an extra Nagash floating around.
All right, so that is, I think, all of my major points for why judging. I think is just, or not necessarily judging, reffing. I think in 40K we still usually call them judges, right? But anyways, a like codified rules enforcement organization is important, right? Like it brings so much to the game as a player. It brings so much to the game as like it more like it legitimizes it. That's the word I was looking for. It really legitimizes the game as like a competitive thing. Like there's no other like legitimate competitive body in the world that's just like, we are a competitive organization and all of the players enforce their own rules, and it's fine. Like no, like there's people who there's the rule book, there's the actual rules of the game, there's the fixes for when people make mistakes in the rules, there's the punishments for people who make mistakes too often, there's the people who enforce the rules, there's the rules for the people who enforce the rules. Like there's a structure, and 40K is a little Wild Westy right now. And
yeah, like imagine international soccer, but like without FIFA and the shit show that would be. I mean, imagine like aside from like the obvious utopia that what that
apart
is.
from the international corruption, that's fine.
As a person who's related to a lot of British people, I have a lot of family out in Britain. People hate FIFA, so maybe a different example.
The platonic idea of FIFA. Let's go with that.
Yes, the utopian ideal of FIFA, not like. Like I know if FIFA were abolished, everybody would shoot confetti into the air, but
like American football. Like, what would American football look like if they just like there weren't any refs? They just put the teams on the field, right? That's what they call it, a field. I'm a sports guy, obviously.
They did that. It was an Adam Sandler movie called The Longest Yard.
I mean,
like be chaos.
I think of playing like a pickup basketball game, and there's just definitely people who you wouldn't play with just because they either like they're just like too rough, like
they just check it really hard.
We can even get we can leave the realm of sports ball and talk about what's it like to play Magic without judges, and we know what it's like to play because the 90s existed, and part of playing the game was knowing how to get away with things. Like that was part of the experience, is being able to call out your opponent and also seeing how you could get away with it. Like it's an uncomfortable part of the past, but it's also where it kind of grew out of. Like that stuff isn't tolerated anymore for good reason, and like that's where 40K should be going to.
That's probably worth mentioning, right? I did not play Magic in the 90s as I was 2. But right, Magic did sort of had a Wild West of rules enforcement at one point, and it did kind of grow out of that. So yeah, Burns, want to elaborate that a little bit more? Like what was Magic like in the 90s?
Well, I was also like 9 when the 90s ended, but I do, having been a judge and having to enjoying a lot of the old style, like old parts of Magic
back in my day.
Back in my day, there was just like, so there was a classic incident at a pro tour back when pro tours were still a thing for Magic, where somebody was playing a game and there was a point where there was a rules infraction. They looked at the top 5 cards, they chose one and they put it into their hands, but they were supposed to reveal all the cards and what they picked out of it. So they had to stop and figure out what was going on, like figure out how they were going to resolve it, because they had moved a card that should have been revealed, but he put it in his hand, so now they couldn't figure out how to give out which card, etc. Anyway, the caster in charge at the time was like, oh, this player, this is like straight out from the history books where like, you kind of try and do anything, get away with anything. And everyone in chat was just screaming like, what are you talking about? You can't just like talk about this anymore, because this player was like, he was essentially branding this player as being an old time.
This is a recent event.
Recent, like 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay,
I think this was,
and someone else was like, "Oh man, this was like what you would do 10 years ago."
Yeah, so it was one Hall of Famer talking about another Hall of Famer. So it was Randy Buehler talking about Pat Chapin while they were playing in Pro Tour. Cons of Tarkir, I think, was the one, because there's siege rhinos everywhere. And he was resolving a trigger, and they screwed up, and Randy was like, oh, Pat Chapin played in the old days where they would, this would be totally like regular, like all this kind of thing. And it's true. It was, not only was it true, but it also was kind of like branding Pat Chapin as sort of like a player who might be expected to do these kinds of things. And it was awful because, it's been like a decade and a half since any of that kind of stuff had occurred. And like, there's a number of reasons that were problematic, but like that was the expectation. Randy Buehler was talking about it because he experienced it, because he was a Magic champion in, I don't know, 99 or 98 or what have you.
That was the awkward one where like Pat Chapin kind of made the flourish and showed it to the camera, but not to his opponent. Was that one?
It was doubly awkward because he only had one card in his hand. He only had one card in his hand at the time, so his opponent could know. His opponent was able to logically deduce what card was the card he knew about and what card was the one revealed. But because the way that the card texter ruled, and because I think there was a gameplay infraction earlier that had happened, it was kind of a minor disaster where like he might have going to getting a game lost because of it, even though it wasn't technically breaking, like it wasn't ruining the game at any point. This is like a first world problem, right? Like this is only a problem because Magic is so codified and so ready to like handle these situations that like then the players were like, oh no, Pat Chapin's getting like ruined by this rule, et cetera, et cetera.
So having not seen this, I do to kind of explain to chat a little bit what's going on. I know the rule, right, is if you have two hidden sets, right, like sets of cards. Like if I have a hidden hand, right, you don't know what's in my hands, and then there's like another set of like hidden cards, and I've now combined them, right. I'm gonna take this card off the top of the deck and put it into my hands. Well, I have two cards, and like unless I'm like shuffling them up, like you could point at the one that just like came off the top of my deck. And generally you'd want to give the other player the option to do that. But now we're back to like the social contract thing where like if you do right, if before you call the judge, right, it's like I go, oh, oops, I was supposed to show you this one, and then like you weren't, and I was like, I swear it was this one, here, look at it. And then the judge comes over, like, well, now I put in your mind like, oh yeah, it was definitely this one. And you just don't want to give people the opportunity to like ever like you just don't want to give people the opportunity to like try to get away with stuff like that. So you just have to make it 100% of the time. There were two cards. The other person never saw either of them. They got put next to each other. All right, like we just have to enforce a rule now. Like it doesn't matter if you think you can point at the right one.
Yeah, and the thing in this situation was that Pat was arguing quite vehemently that like it was very obvious which card was which. There was a number of reasons. I mean, this was a pro tour. These people were playing for tens of thousands of dollars at the time. It was a televised match. The stakes were high. And just that Randy was like, oh, in 95, like this would totally be a thing where like you try and like the cards and you try and get away with it. And like everybody's like, Randy, we don't talk about this anymore. Like we don't do that. Like this isn't, you don't want to label anybody like that.
So what did that journey look like? Like what happened between, the 90s and now that just like, we don't talk about it anymore, right? It's just rules. We're all so used to, like, I never played in a time when like you didn't just call a judge for everything. Like what did they do to change? Because I don't, 40K is not like, oh, cheating's everywhere. You just like, you learn how to cheat or you don't win. But there is a bit of like, you have to enforce your own rules or you're not going to get through a tournament because you'll run into like someone who doesn't know rules or someone who is a bad actor. And like, you need to know how to like enforce a rule at that table. Like how do we go from there to like full on, we are, rules enforcement personnel for everything? Like what did Magic do?
So Magic, this is kind of stepping out of my foray in
fair
terms of
enough.
like games knowledge, but I do know that a lot of it had to do with um, professional players, like high stakes players, players who were doing well and winning at the higher levels. They had to call out people. They like made it their mission to personally call out cheaters, call out people who they know had cheated in a match. And this kind of, I wish I had the player's name in front of me, but it was a person who wasn't in the Hall of Fame for a long time, but they inevitably did get in the Hall of Fame because of their efforts to make Magic a more legitimate game. Because they had been ostracized essentially after that point. At that time, like Magic or like competitive Magic was kind of like clubbish in terms of like who's in, who's out, who do you talk to, who do you not talk to, and so it was put on the players. I mean, obviously as well, the DCI was formed, judges became a regular thing, judge structure, competitive, like the rule enforcement levels were introduced, the everything, all that infrastructure was put in place as well. But sort of the tipping point was players making a stand and saying that this was wrong and that this wasn't part of the game.
So you're saying it was mostly players, although there was also that Wizards also kind of creating an infrastructure, right?
Yeah, it was both. I think Chris Pakula was the one in particular who was doing a lot of the spearheading of like players saying this isn't acceptable, and then Watsy on the other side was saying like we need to come up with rules to make sure that people are having a uniform experience. Like this isn't like necessary. When I speak about this, it sounds I sound like I'm giving a very altruistic part of this. It's very utilitarian. You want to make sure that your players that you want to like have a stake in the game are going to have a good time. And to the best way to make sure people are having a good time. I don't have a cat to hold, by the way. It's unfortunate. The best way to make sure players have a good time is to make sure that cheating doesn't happen. So Watsy was heavily incentivized to like come up with this sort of thing.
I think like, and also important, like the perception of cheating doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, the general perception of cheating in general is just completely changed. Instead of it being like a skill you cultivate, it's like your persona non grata. There's been a couple. It's not, now that Arena's a thing, Magic the Gathering Arena, for anyone who hasn't played it, is sort of their free to play online experience for Magic, where judges aren't a problem. Like judges aren't needed anymore because the rules. It's just a computer game. And so before that, though, when there was sort of a big league circuit that was occurring, there were a couple players that were like infamous for having been caught cheating. Like they were really name and shamed. It's like when as Reddit became more of a thing, that was like really popular, seeing like people who would cheat on stream. You can always find some really interesting things on stream, or like people just doing brazen things on video, which is wild to me. But yeah, they're ostracized nowadays. They don't get a free pass.
Yeah, so I used to play competitive paintball when I was younger, and like, how do you know when you're out in paintball? Well, obviously there's a bit of paint on you. Well, what if you just went like this? Yeah, now you're not out anymore, and if nobody saw it, then you're good to go. And it's like that 90s culture that we saw in Magic, where like, yeah, it's cheating, but people were also known on their ability to be discreet and consistent wipers.
Yeah,
like I remember I was at a big national level tournament, and me and my buddies were watching somebody play, watching a team play, and this guy got shot on the side of his hopper, and he instantly just brought his gun like to his chest and like was moving around like he was trying to like just look around like the bunker and everything while going like this, and then like when he came back up it was gone, and everyone was just at the sidelines just like, well done, that was nice.
Yeah, I remember vividly the Xbox god Greg Hastings paintball or whatever. I can't tell you what the name of the player was who did those things, but you could actually wipe as part of like a game setting. Like you could like try and get away with it, like pinball tilting almost, where it's like they'll give you the option to like do it. And in Arena you can't try and surreptitiously draw an extra card while they're like making a move or whatever,
because it's not part of the game.
Right.
If Magic Arena was a thing back in the 90s, then like maybe there could have been like a thing where if you want to try to sneak one past, like instead of clicking on the deck, you click with both mouse buttons.
And I think more than just like, oh yes, like we want to like make sure no one's ever cheating. Like it makes the game so much more relaxed when you know, like when I roll up to a random person, like I don't know you, I'm not going to assume you're cheating, but like you never know, right? But like if this exists, right? If there's like when I play Magic, like I know that a lot of people who are like known cheaters have just been ejected from the game and just like actually can't be there. Like I've known people who've been caught cheating and just like get banned from stores and like can't play anymore. Um, and like if this exists for 40K, then you just get to go into games with a much more relaxed attitude of like, yeah, like
You don't have
you're
to be
probably a
on
good-
edge.
yeah, like let's like yeah, you're like probably like a good actor because the bad actors have like been caught or like have to be like have to be way more under the radar. Like blatant cheating is just like, I mean, blatant cheating is like never okay because like people will boot you from events, but the fact that like it can be punishments can carry over to events outside of like your one of this like one store is like a big deal, and like until that's in place, it's just really hard to pin that down when someone can like get banned from an event or a store and just be like, all right, like I'll play somewhere else. That's fine.
To put a bow on it, Burns, I believe you already brought up yours, but Ben, Chris, would you like to bring up or actually Ben, you also did. Chris, do you have a war story of an event that you wouldn't like that you would think would go away, or uh in a previous event that had happened that you feel like wouldn't be happening under the new system? Any good stories? Any good?
Yeah, so I had one event. It was like a pretty casual like doubles event, which, just playing for fun. In a casually competitive setting. Where I was up against a Tau player and I was playing Chaos, and there was a question of order of operations for the combat phase, for the fight phase, which I know like the back of my hand because I play Chaos. But the other person was playing Taos, and they were confused on how the thing worked. I said like, "Oh yeah, I pile in, I fight, I consolidate, and then I activate another guy." And they thought that it was all everybody piles in, everybody fights, and then everybody consolidates. And the call was made to To um to arbitrate. The issue was the To was this Tau player's spouse, and also didn't know the fight phase well either. And unfortunately, this kind of falls on me because like I knew what the rule was. I knew what it was, and I looked in the rule book, and I couldn't like figure out like exactly like it was outlined clearly in the rule book. At least I thought. Um, but I didn't realize that if I just turned the rule book one more page, there was a very clear and concise like example of what happens with multiple units in combat. But with a clearer system, I don't think that would have happened because I don't think the To would have also been the judge for like the whole event in general, not just being the judge for their spouse's game.
All right, and that goes back to like like having tournament or TOs have to know every single rule, every single codex is like probably beyond the pale of what's necessary. But basic, or like I would expect any sort of judge tests for 40K to be like, you need to describe exactly what happens in the combat phase for like 5 different units fighting each other. Like, here's a complex combat phase. Is this legal? Like, did people mess up? Like, I would expect that to be a question.
Probably a
Yeah.
multiple choice of like, and then like a sequence, but yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah. It'll, to put it in Magic terms, it'd be something like, Agatha activates a unit and piles in and fights. After fighting, what happens next? And then it gives like 4 different scenarios.
Sure.
But yeah, these are.
All right, Kevin, what's your war story?
All right. So I got in an argument with somebody. Now this isn't for 40K, it's for AOS, but kind of the same vagueness with rules.
Sure.
And it had to do with bases. So there was an argument that the person was going to be allowed to use square bases at an event. Because according to the rules, there were no rules on bases. So even putting no bases was more okay and more in the spirit of what GW wanted than using the bases that came in the box. This is a very frustrating moment because it's like, without having that certified rule or knowing that like the person like the rules are actually going to be upheld, there's no really countercourse to that. It's like, I guess you could say, because you are kind of pointing to a document that says like we have no official base size. Now admittedly this was like 2.5 years ago, and since then AOS is like, these are our official base sizes for these models.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I was going to ask if this was before or after that initial like document was released.
I think
I could expect it fully coming up on either side, to be honest. Like with or without document, you don't have
to be
documents,
fair,
so like how
didn't
can we enforce
Sigmar
it?
start with just like, hey, here are some models, here are like a couple of rules, just start rolling some fucking dice?
Keep in mind, AOS is 5 years old, Chris. Yeah, that was for the first 2 years, but 2.5 years ago is 3 years into the game. I know that might that's a scary time frame to talk about AOS, but
I think AOS is another great example of game will become more popular the more like you put time into rules making sense and being.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just like I think that if you look at Age of Sigmar on release and Age of Sigmar after second edition came out, it is a very different game. And they went from going totally relaxed with the rules, where a lot of the rules were very like narrative, like whoever has the longest beard gets to have like +1 on the hit or what have you, to actually being very similar to 40K's 8th edition. And AOS second edition exploded in popularity. So it seems like it's what the players want.
I'm personally hoping for an AOS third edition this year, and in that double turns go away. That's what I want. More than anything.
Just to go back to your Warshare, were you both playing in an event, or were you trying to run an event and you had a player who was just like, I'm gonna bring square bases and you can't stop me?
We were talking about setting up a league.
Gotcha. And the player was just like, I'm bringing square bases and no one can stop me?
They initially started there, and then they said like, well, I'm looking into this more, and I believe I can get away with no bases, so that'll be better for my piling in.
I'm glad this isn't me. I was concerned it was me for a second, because I have a huge skeleton army that is all square bases, and I was also not sure about wanting to rebase everything. But I never made the idea of like, I should just go with no bases. Aha!
Yeah, I'm just gonna push my units into balls and push them at you, and it's fine. They all get to fight. They're all.
If I have a big model with wings, I can just put the model forward like this, right? It doesn't count as movement, but it expands the range.
All right. I think.
All right. Okay. You have to live up to that one, Ben. Okay. So when I started playing 40K, there was a misreading of the 8th edition rulebook, and playing with Ben, who taught me, it's like, yeah, the actual model is like what the range is measured by. So let me tell you about Magnus's staff.
Yes,
it could really swing some charges.
That is actually not what Burns was referring to, but
you're talking about. I know you're talking about the Demon Prince, where it's like, I only want to charge the character that's in the front, not the 2 units on the side.
We are actually referring to a Hive Tyrant that was placed on its back, so its wing can reach out and touch something behind a building.
Correct.
But yes, all right. This is the sort of like, this is the sort of thing that a rules enforcement organization like wouldn't fix, because this was a bunch of people like who'd played 5 games of Warhammer between them, like learning the rules, and we hadn't like read the core rule book correctly. And that's another thing that judges do for Magic. All right, and I'm going to try and end this off here. Is that judges are also the people who they get tested, they know the rules very well, and then they are oftentimes the individuals who are kind of tasked with like bringing new people into the game, teaching them the rules correctly. So rules mistakes like that particular piece of nonsense doesn't get like propagated throughout a whole community.
Yep. If GW wants to look at this through the lens of this being like a community growth or outreach program, I think that's the best way to sell it. Not just the GW, but to just the 40K community as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
You want it even if you don't know it.
Yeah. You need advocates, you need ambassadors, not just for the players, but for the system itself.
Yep. And I think that's a good place to end on. Any closing thoughts or comments from anybody?
Something about bells and liking and buttons and smashing and ringing.
Despite what allegations against his staff and what it may or may not have been done to abuse that non-rule, Magnus has done nothing wrong.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning into this week's episode. We're streaming live on Twitch every Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. at Twitch/3d6charge. We're also anywhere that you can find podcasts once I pay the bill for the podcast hosting. Um, and I'd like to give a special thank you to Mike Burns for joining us tonight and giving us his insight on what the judge system has given to the competitive Magic scene. So yeah, Mike, thank you again very much for coming on and chatting with us tonight. And
happy to be here, Chris. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and shout out to my contributors, Kevin Lieb and Benjamin Rubenstein.
I don't know, Mike. I wanted you to be on, but you made me look like a schmuck being like everyone else wearing collared shirts and I'm wearing a t-shirt. Come on.
I had to represent our wayward local game store.
All right. So with that, let's sign off. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and until next week, don't roll any ones.